Picture Anne Boleyn not as Henry VIII's other woman, not as the future queen, not even as the girl who'd one day become a lightning rod for religious change. Picture her as a teenager in a foreign court, surrounded by the children of Europe's ruling elite, absorbing languages, manners, music, politics, and the rules of power. Because before Anne Boleyn was the woman who captivated a king, she was finished. She was made slowly and deliberately in two of the most dazzling Renaissance courts in Europe. First in the Low Countries at the court of Margaret of Austria, regent of the Low Countries, who presided over a cultural powerhouse in Mechelen. And then in France, where Anne served in the orbit of queens, scholars, diplomats, and some of the most formidable women of the age. And all this matters because if you truly want to understand why Anne Boleyn stood out, why she made such an impact when she returned to England, and why Henry VIII saw her as more than a fling, you have to start here. So let's go back to the courts that shaped Anne Boleyn. When we talk about elite education in the early 16th century, it's very easy to imagine boys being sent off to serve in great households. And yes, that was common. They'd be pages, squires, they'd learn to ride, hunt, fight, and manoeuvre in the world of aristocratic expectation, and learn skills for court. But Anne wasn't a boy, was she? And yet her father, Thomas Boleyn, gave her a version of that same opportunity by sending her abroad to serve as a maid of honour in one of the most prestigious courts in Europe. Now, of course, there were menial tasks for her to carry out, waiting, serving, being part of the great machinery of household life. But this kind of placement was also a kind of finishing school where young people were trained in deportment and etiquette, courtly manners and conversation, music and dance, riding, hunting, falconry, languages, especially French, and crucially, how to observe power and navigate it. And Thomas Boleyn wasn't doing this for fun. He was ambitious, for himself certainly, but he was also ambitious for his children. He wanted Anne equipped for a high-level role, and that choice would shape her whole life. Thomas Boleyn had met Margaret of Austria in 1512 when he was sent as an ambassador by Henry VIII to the Low Countries. Margaret wasn't simply a grand lady with a glamorous household. She was regent of the Netherlands, appointed in 1507 to govern on behalf of her young nephew, the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. She was regent of the Low Countries, appointed in 1507 to govern on behalf of her young nephew, the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Now, Margaret herself is fascinating. Daughter of Emperor Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy, born in 1480. She spent her formative years in France, preparing to be Queen Consort, until French politics swept that away. She spoke French fluently. She was very French in her style and ways, and that matters because that French elegance and sophistication is something Anne would later be known for. Margaret's own life was threaded with loss. She married John, Prince of Asturias, and was widowed after only 6 months. She later married Philip II, Duke of Savoy, and lost him too. She vowed never to marry again and spent the rest of her life in mourning. And yet she was no passive widow in black veils. This woman ran a regency, hosted one of Europe's most impressive courts, and became a magnet for humanists, artists, musicians, and diplomats. And we get a glimpse of how well she and Thomas Boleyn got on, because in August 1512, they were on such good terms that Margaret actually made a playful bet with him. She wagered that her father, Emperor Maximilian, would allow them to conclude their negotiations within 10 days. If Thomas won the wager, Margaret would give him a Spanish courser. If Margaret won, Thomas would give her a hobby, an Irish hobby, a fast little horse associated with Ireland. And as historian Retha Warnick points out, the fact that Margaret asked for a hobby suggests that she had some personal knowledge of Thomas's background and connections, because Thomas was an heir of the Irish earldom of Ormond. It's a small detail, but it tells you something important. Thomas wasn't just a name on a diplomatic paper. He was someone that Margaret genuinely liked, and that relationship helped open a door for his daughter. Historian Eric Ives famously described Margaret's court as the Mecca of aristocratic and princely behaviour, and also Europe's premier finishing school. If Thomas Boleyn wanted his daughter trained at the highest level, this was the place. And whichever birth date you favour for Anne, she was still very young when she arrived, young enough that these years really mattered. By spring or summer 1513, Anne Boleyn was dispatched to Mechelen. Margaret accepted Anne as one of 18 maids of honour appointed at that time, filles d'honneur. And she wrote to Thomas Boleyn soon after Anne arrived, obviously delighted with Anne, saying, "I've received your letter by the Esquire Bouton, who has presented your daughter to me, who is very welcome. I find her so bright and pleasant for her young age that I am more beholden to you for sending her to me than you are to me." Anne is young, intelligent, and she sets about absorbing everything. And we have something very precious from this period, Anne's own letter to her father, written from Lavour, the royal park at Brussels, where Margaret often spent the summer. Anne's spelling and orthography are imperfect, and she apologises for it. But she's a young girl learning, working hard to become fluent and trying to make her father proud. She writes about her desire to be a worthy woman at court and how the thought of conversing with a wise and worthy queen fills her with joy. She talks about practising French, spelling, writing. And there's a little detail in that letter that I love. Anne explains that someone in the household, a tutor, Simone, tells her the wording, but deliberately waits so that she can write it herself. She's being guided, but she's also being made to do it, to learn properly. And then she signs herself Anne de Bouillon. Even in that, you can sense the continental environment shaping her. Anne was working hard to write and communicate in French, working hard to belong, and she was doing it inside a court that was in many ways a cultural powerhouse. Belgian historian Ghislaine de Boom described Margaret's palace at Mechelen as what translates to a princely school and a centre of high culture. Margaret's court was visited by figures like Erasmus. It had a superb library containing poetry, missals, histories, and works by writers like Christine de Pizan, who challenged misogyny and stereotypes of women. Add to that Boccaccio, Aesop, Ovid, Aristotle. Wow. Margaret collected paintings by masters such as Jan van Eyck, commissioned and preserved illuminated manuscripts, and cultivated music. She surrounded herself with poets, painters, men of letters. This wasn't just a finishing school. This was a place where you learned how the Renaissance elite thought, not merely how they stood and walked. And it wasn't all solemn learning either. Margaret also enjoyed the traditions of courtly love, an integral element of chivalry, the complex of attitudes and rituals that also sat right at the heart of Tudor court culture. So here is Anne absorbing a court language that will make perfect sense in England later, but at an exceptionally high level. And there's another crucial piece here. Margaret demonstrated that a woman could rule, that she could exercise authority, negotiate with foreign powers, shape culture, patronise artists, and hold her own in the world of men. Historian Sarah Gristwood makes a lovely observation that Margaret was a figure of international authority, and if Anne Boleyn was to learn that a woman could advance ideas, exercise power, and control her destiny, she could hardly have been in better hands. Anne lived in an environment where female authority was not a theory, it was a reality. And she was seeing all that in her formative years. And what Anne absorbed at Mechelen didn't necessarily stay there. Later you can see continental tastes filtering into England, Flemish musical styles becoming fashionable, and the Boleyns patronising artists like Gerard and Lucas Hornbolt, pioneers of miniature portraiture in England. Eric Ives even suggests that the Whitehall that Henry and Anne rebuilt echoed architectural ideas that Anne had encountered abroad. Whether you take every single link as direct or not, the broader point stands. Anne's continental education shaped her tastes, and England would feel that. But just as she's settling into this extraordinary court, her time there is cut short. In 1514, after just a year with Margaret of Austria, Anne is appointed to serve a new mistress, Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's youngest sister, who, at 18 years old, is travelling to France to marry Louis XII, who's 52. And we have another wonderful document, Thomas Boleyn's letter to Margaret of Austria, dated the 14th of August 1514, written in French. He explains that Mary Tudor, the soon-to-be Queen of France, has requested his daughter, La Petite Boleyn, by her side, along with his other daughter, Mary. And Thomas says essentially, I cannot refuse this request, and I don't even know how I could. So he asks Margaret to grant Anne leave and release her into the care of the escort he's sent. Now, whether Margaret received the letter in time for Anne to travel to England to go with Mary to France is unclear. Eric Ives suggests that Margaret may have been visiting the islands of Zealand at the time and might not have been able to send Anne back quickly. So it's possible that Anne travelled directly to France rather than returning to England first. And we don't even know whether she reached France in time for the wedding on the 9th of October 1514 at Abbeville. Which is intriguing because there's a tapestry depicting the wedding, which you can see at Hever Castle. And the temptation to go, is that her, is very human. I've stood in front of it and looked at the women in it a few times, wondering if Anne is depicted. Anne might instead have joined them in time for Mary's coronation in Paris on the 9th of November. But what we do know is that Anne went, and she was now in the orbit of the French court. After the royal marriage, Louis XII dismissed many of Mary Tudor's English attendants, sending them home. But Mademoiselle Boleyn was among the few retained. Anne stayed. Then, on the 1st of January 1515, Louis XII died. He'd suffered from gout for years, and over Christmas 1514 he was particularly ill. Contemporary French belief blamed the marriage on the young Mary Tudor, that the ageing king had overexerted himself in the bedroom with her. Whether that's fair or not, it tells you what people were thinking. Mary was isolated at the Hôtel de Cluny while they waited to see if she was pregnant. She wasn't. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, was sent to escort her home. And this is where we get that dramatic, risky, secret marriage between Brandon and Mary in France in early 1515, without Henry VIII's permission, something that could genuinely be interpreted as treason. Henry was furious, but he loved his sister and he loved Brandon. And the marriage was ultimately forgiven and formalised at Greenwich in May 1515. So Mary Tudor has gone back to England, and France has a new king, Francis of Angoulême, now Francis I, crowned on the 25th of January 1515. But Anne hasn't returned to England. She's been retained to serve the new queen, Queen Claude, who was around 15, not much older than Anne. Anne would remain in France until late 1521, nearly 7 years. So what did France mean for Anne? As historian Estelle Paronque argues, those years weren't just a glamorous interlude. They were in many ways a trigger, a formative experience that helped shape the Anne who later returned to England. Not in some melodramatic France corrupted her way, we'll come to that myth in a moment, but in the far more interesting sense that France gave her models of power, culture and influence. Now, we tend to picture Francis I as the centre of the French Renaissance court, flamboyant, martial, charismatic. Anne would have observed him. It's hard not to be influenced by the sheer performance of kingship that Francis embodied. And Estelle makes a compelling comparison. Francis as in some ways Henry VIII's French mirror, the rivalry, the male air pressure, the theatrical kingship. However, Anne's daily life was far more anchored in the Queen's world, and Claude must have had an influence on Anne. Claude was pious, serious, and sadly often exhausted by the demands placed on her body. Between 1515 and 1521, when Anne was serving her, Claude had 5 babies and was pregnant with a 6th. She was frequently away from the glittering centre of court because she was constantly in childbearing mode and choosing to spend her time in the more peaceful setting of the Loire Valley. Anne was a young woman serving in the Queen's household, and she would have been watching day after day, year after year, what queenship required, what dynastic pressure looked like, what it cost. It's not hard to imagine how that left an imprint. And it also helps us understand something later. Anne is not naive about the stakes of producing an heir. She's watched that pressure in action and seen the toll that it took on Claude. There's also the question of morality and reputation, because this is where the corrupted at the French court cliché often pops up. It's sometimes claimed that Anne was corrupted at the French court, but there is no evidence of that. And Claude was known as a strict and pious mistress. Pierre de Baudet, Seigneur de Brantôme, later described her as wise, virtuous, charitable, gentle, and wrote of her court as a noble school for ladies, where women were taught and brought up wisely, taking their pattern from Claude herself. That's not the description of a queen presiding over a den of corruption. But Anne did become French in style, in polish, sophistication, language and cultural confidence. And we have a striking piece of testimony about that from Lancelot de Carle, secretary to the French ambassador in England during Anne's queenship. In his poem on Anne's death, he describes her as arriving young at the French court, listening carefully, imitating the ladies in waiting, learning the language rapidly, and becoming so thoroughly shaped that nobody considered her English in her ways, but native French. He talks about her singing and dancing well, phrasing sentiments wisely, playing the lute and other instruments. In his poem, he's emphasising formation. Anne learned, she watched, absorbed and mastered the social world of a Renaissance court. And then there's the cultural side of all this, because Anne didn't just learn how to behave at court, she was also immersed in a very particular Renaissance atmosphere. Art, books, music, and that constant sense that culture mattered. Anne's later tastes, her love of illuminated manuscripts, her interest in devotional texts, her patronage and her obvious delight in learning don't come out of nowhere. The foundations for that were laid on the continent. It was at Margaret of Austria's court that she first encountered a household rich in books, manuscripts, art and music. And in France, serving Queen Claude, those influences were deepened and refined. France under Francis I was a court that performed the Renaissance. Culture wasn't tucked away in private studies. It was displayed, collected, discussed and celebrated. Francis deliberately fashioned himself as a Renaissance prince, surrounding himself with artists, thinkers, and symbols of intellectual prestige. And of course, this is the court that drew Leonardo da Vinci to France. Francis invited him across the Alps, and Leonardo spent his final years living at the Château de Clos-Lucé near Amboise, where the king himself spent a great deal of time. And Anne spent a lot of time at Amboise as well with Queen Claude. So could Anne have met Leonardo? It's possible, though we can't prove it. And we also know Claude often preferred to be at Blois, which Francis renovated for her. But even if Anne never shook Leonardo da Vinci's hand, she was living inside a court culture that valued Renaissance artistry, display, humanist learning, and fashion. And then there are the major set-piece events where Anne may have been present. Claude's coronation at Saint-Denis in May 1516, her entry into Paris, her entry into Cognac in 1520, the banquet at the Bastille in December 1518 for English diplomats negotiating a marriage between the Dauphin and Henry VIII's daughter Mary, and of course the Field of Cloth of Gold in June 1520. At the Field of Cloth of Gold, Claude's appearance made a real impression. Eric Ives describes her in cloth of silver with an underskirt of cloth of gold, travelling in a coronation litter, and her ladies similarly draped and lightly dressed to match. Anne was part of that, and she almost certainly saw Henry VIII there, and hopefully had chance to see her family too. There's one more element of continental court culture that we need to talk about because it follows Anne back to England and becomes part of her queenship in a very visible way. And it's something I've mentioned. It's the tradition of courtly love. Courtly love wasn't simply about romance. It was a structured, performative culture of flirtation, admiration, poetry, symbolism, and display. It allowed men and women at court to enact roles, lover, admirer, lady, patron, within a framework that was supposed to be refined, elevated and controlled. At courts like Margaret of Austria's, and even more so at the French court, this tradition was woven into daily life. It shaped conversation, behaviour, gift-giving, poetry, music, and the social rituals of elite households. It was part of how power and favour were negotiated and part of how identity was performed. And Anne would have been immersed in this from a young age. She was growing up in courts where women were admired, praised, written about, symbolised in verse and song, where a lady's wit, elegance and presence were part of her power, and where attraction could be stylised and controlled. And this matters because Anne didn't leave that culture behind when she returned to England. Historians John Guy and Julia Fox, in their book Hunting the Falcon, place enormous weight on Anne's continental experience. They argue that what she saw in Europe, the models of power, of female authority, of court culture, shaped the queen she became. And we can see that very clearly in the way that Anne ran her household once she was queen. Anne's chambers were not spaces where women withdrew from the male world. Men were present. Courtiers gathered. Conversation, music, flirtation and sociability flourished. Guy and Fox describe Anne's style as a French-style court of pleasure and courtly love. It was vibrant, it was modern, it was continental, but it was also risky. Because in England, this kind of culture was unfamiliar, unsettling, and easy to misinterpret. What in France would be read as elegant performance could in England be recast as moral laxity. The presence of men in the Queen's chambers, the informality, the wit, the intimacy of tone, all of this could be twisted into something it wasn't. And indeed later, it was used against Anne. When Anne fell, the charge was not simply that she had enemies or that she'd failed to produce a son. It was that she'd behaved in ways that could be reinterpreted as sexually improper. Words, jokes, glances, gestures, the very tools of courtly culture, were stripped of context and recast as evidence. Men that had visited Anne's household were cast as men who'd slept with the Queen. What Anne had learned abroad had given her confidence, presence and cultural power, but it had also left her exposed. The courtly love tradition had taught her that a woman could be admired, could shape a room, could command attention and could be the centre of a court. It didn't prepare her for how dangerous that would become in a political culture ready to destroy her. And that's one of the great tragedies of Anne Boleyn's story, that the very qualities shaped by her continental education, her charm, her confidence, her visibility, her ability to animate a court, were later turned into weapons against her. What made her extraordinary also made her incredibly vulnerable. Now, one of the most important things about Anne's time in France is not just the fashion and music and language, it's the women she encountered. Because France wasn't a court where women were invisible. Anne would have been very much aware of Louise of Savoy, Francis I's mother. Intelligent, politically astute, serving as regent. And there's a lesson there for Anne. Having a son gives you power. Louise's position is shaped by being the king's mother. Anne would also have been aware of Margaret of Angoulême, later Queen of Navarre, Francis's sister, who was highly educated, independent, a patron of the arts, interested in reformist ideas, exchanging letters with humanists. Estelle Perron paints Marguerite as a kind of second Francis, a powerful figure always at her brother's side, and that surely would have impressed a young woman like Anne. Here was a model of female influence that doesn't rely on being queen consort in the conventional sense. Now, we can't prove what conversations Anne might have overheard, but it's entirely plausible that she was in an environment where humanist and reformist ideas were discussed, where criticisms of corruption could circulate, where women could be patrons, protectors, persuaders. And then we have a particularly valuable friendship. Renée of France, Claude's sister, later Duchess of Ferrara. Renée later told Nicholas Throckmorton in Anne's daughter's reign that she and Anne were old friends from when Anne was maid of honour to Queen Claude. She described Anne as a virtuous and sage lady. That's significant. Not only does it underline the corruption myth as nonsense, it also gives us a sense of Anne's reputation from someone who actually knew her. Retha Warnick notes that Claude was often in residence near Renée in the royal nursery because Claude was so tied up in childbearing, and Anne would have accompanied her mistress. Renée later became known for heretical beliefs and for protecting reformers. That doesn't automatically mean Anne became reformist because of Renée, but it's an interesting parallel when we consider Anne's later protection of reform-minded people. And then there's Diane de Poitiers. Educated, witty, later the famous mistress of Henry II. We can't prove closeness, but the overlap in court circles is real. So Anne isn't just learning, she's observing female power in multiple forms: regency, sisterly influence, patronage, networks, protection. And that must have made an impact. In late 1521, Anne is recalled to England. Francis I was worried that the recall of Claude's English lady-in-waiting and English students in Paris might signal English intent to make war on France. But Wolsey assures him that it's Wolsey's doing, and he explains that he's recalled Anne because he intended by Anne's marriage to pacify certain quarrels and litigation involving the Boleyns and other nobles. In other words, Anne's return isn't just personal, it's political, and it sets the stage for what comes next. But I want to end this episode by thinking about what those years abroad gave Anne and what they didn't. Her time in Mechelen and France gave her language, the ability to move fluently in French settings, confidence in elite environments, polish and cultural sophistication, an understanding of courtly performance and spectacle, a strong sense that women could hold authority and influence, exposure to a world of books, art, music, and the Renaissance taste for learning, and perhaps most importantly, a practical education in how dynastic politics turns on the bodies and reputations of women. And that's a heavy lesson. And it's why when Anne returned to England, she didn't simply blend in as another maid at court. She stood out. She'd been trained at the heart of Europe's Renaissance culture, first at Margaret of Austria's finishing school court, then in the orbit of the French monarchy. And so when Henry VIII eventually noticed her, really noticed her, he wasn't seeing a woman who'd been sheltered in an English household all her life. He was seeing someone who'd lived abroad, who'd absorbed continental sophistication, who knew how to hold herself, how to speak, how to present, how to navigate influence. A real Renaissance woman. Anne Boleyn had received in many ways a princess's education, and Thomas Boleyn had given his daughter an extraordinary opportunity. And in the next episode of this series, we'll look at what happens when Anne returns to England. Thank you for joining me.